is the first time the Migrant and Minority Ethnic Council have taken part in the ESRC Festival, and we're delighted this year the theme is the environment. Big thank you to Ken Fearon and to Joanna Grieve, who are working with us today on this festival from the ESRC committee. And this is a hybrid event. So today you'll see speakers coming to the front, as like myself, and also those coming in through video and also recordings. The event will be a really interesting event. And how did we come up with it? Well, Dr. Dina Bellucci from the MME think tank will be setting the context and telling you how we came up with this event. But we're delighted we're going to have a whole wide range of topics from consular activities to local community activism from Northern Ireland to Philippines. We also will have talk about the global development and environment from our keynote speaker, Anna Clarke. And also, of course, you can't escape without some creativity, music and arts from Beyond Skin later. We'll also be having Darren Ferguson talking about music and arts climate change. We'll be looking at the Serial Waste Mid-Ulster project here locally. And we'll also be looking at the challenges, what challenges there are to migrant and minority ethnic communities in this very apt time of talking about hashtag COP26. You know, why were they not taking part? Is it because we have this hostile environment and discrimination taking place with those who have migrated here? In addition, we have Dr. Roxana Barbalesque from Leeds University, who's done research on migration and seasonal workers and looking at the scene of the agriculture sector, particularly after Brexit and in this pandemic situation. Dr. Timothy Agron and Dr. Drew Michael will be telling us about their research on welcoming communities. And finally, our own think tank member, Dr. Maurice McCartney here, will be giving us closing remarks and key points of the seminar. I hope that you enjoy this event, and this would not have been complete without the mapping report done by the Migrant and Minority Ethnic Council, which highlighted that migrant and minority ethnic communities are not taking part in the conversation with the environment and climate. So is this necessarily true? And let me introduce you without further ado, Dr. Dina Bellucci, who will set the context for this. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eileen, and welcome to everybody online and also here in person. It's a lovely event and lovely to have you all with us. So I'm Dina Zoe Belluigi. I'm an academic at Queen's University Belfast and at Nelson Mandela University in South Africa, and I'm the research coordinator for the MME think tank. I'll be speaking today about, informed by really, this collation and mapping study that we did of research that has been produced that relates to migrant and minority ethnic matters in Northern Ireland. I led the study and it was supported by Amanda Lovett, and it's available on our website for everybody to access. There are some limitations to the study. Firstly, we looked at academic research. We do acknowledge that there's a lot of research that was done outside of universities that needs to be looked at too. We primarily focused on 2 Northern Irish universities. That's because they are research intensive. And so they focus on research, and partly it was to ask questions about how universities respond to their social responsibility for all local communities. We also collected sources that were recorded on the repositories of these universities. UK universities have repositories to fulfill their obligations as public research organizations, and that information is meant to be publicly available for members of the public to use. And so we looked at those research repositories, but it's a relatively new intervention in UK universities. And so it's possible that there might be other items that aren't included therein. What it does do is provide a sort of snapshot of the interests and investments in research in these universities. So what we found was that there were a total of 176 items recorded on these databases. The earliest was published in 1990. The most recent, 2021, and of course, ongoing. Of these, only 72 were published in the last 5 years. The last 5 years matters because one wants to think of what's recent, what policy changes there have been, also changes in terms of influx and migration of people. So 176 sources may sound promising, but it's important that we put those impressions in context. In the period, for instance, when Queen's produced their 88 items, 88,412 research items as a whole were recorded. Ulster's 84 items should also be seen in the context of their 34,916 research output items. So what this indicates overall is that this hasn't been an active area of interest and research investment in this context. And so we can anticipate that there are going to be gaps. Knowing that there are omissions and gaps and limitations, you might ask why we went about this. Well, we wanted to share resources that were produced by academics with those beyond the university. That is why we include active links within the report, so that even those papers that might not be accessible to those outside of the university, papers that have firewalls or costs, one can see the authors named, see their contact details, and contact them directly for copies. They're also accessible through the research repository that we created as the MME think tank, which you can see on the screen. And it includes other sources too, including policy and other research, though we haven't had the funding to do that as systematically as we've done this one. It's also often claimed that academic evidence is needed to drive policy or objective solutions. And so we hope that by having this access, it's a way of accessing powerful knowledge for those in Northern Ireland. We wanted to bring to light the research and increase its impact and use value. We wanted to highlight gaps in the research, and that's really what today is about. In trying to address those gaps, we wanted to find ways in supporting the encouragement of partnerships, and also, of course, to inform ourselves as a think tank. So you can see from the slide that I have here, which is taken directly from the report, that overall there was a lot of research done on discrimination, some on criminal justice and education, to a certain extent, an amount on employment, health and legislation, then housing and environment. If one looks at what was done in the last 5 years, that's the lighter color on this bar chart, you will see that there is considerably less done across each space. And again, environment, very low amount, and interestingly, employment too. So I created this infographic, which I know is quite complicated, but I wanted to try to visualize the areas and topics that each of the categories were focused on. And you'll see that research related to the theme today about the environment is the most under-researched, leaving me very little to say about it. If we look specifically at the sources that related to this topic, there were 12 that were explicitly about the environment. And they range from topics such as Belfast's Chinatown through to youth identity and the Indian community, for instance. So they're quite varied. In addition to this, are those produced by Ruth McAvery, who no longer sadly is at a Northern Irish university, but continues to do some research related to these issues. And hers were about migration, labor in agricultural work, and rurality. As you can see from the area under this topic of research done in the last 5 years, so we could say that's current research, most of it is around social issues, the idea of environment as social space, identity forming, and primarily about urban locations. It wasn't strictly about urbanity versus rurality or the natural environment as an area per se. There also seems to be almost an absence of consideration of the issue of space or environment outside of what is described here in Northern Ireland as the green and orange, those divided communities. Or there doesn't seem to be that much consideration of ethnic minority participants or migrant participants as anything but other. But we'll hear more about this from one of the authors of the last text cited here, Ulrike Witten, who's speaking today. So it's fair to say that the issues we are touching on today sit within a gap of academic research. We might want to ask, what might such a gap mean in general? Well, it may indicate that there is nothing of academic significance. To publish, what you need to do is to prove that you're furthering knowledge, academic knowledge. So what might these gaps in research mean? Well, they may indicate that there's nothing of academic significance. And as I was saying, when you publish, you need to indicate that you're furthering knowledge, particularly academic knowledge. And it may be that these gaps indicate that what is discovered in research is already known, or that none of the phenomena add anything new or significant about this context. But academic knowledge is constructed, and it reflects in what it chooses and in what it omits, the constructions of its authors, its systems, its cultures, and its leaders. So it may be that what is happening is that what might be studied is not considered of interest by those who are powerful, whether that be those who fund research, those who reference research for decision-making, or those within institutions, including academics, don't find it of interest. And this is why the issue of academic composition being democratized is of particular importance. So this idea of disinterest, it may be legitimate, or it may indicate that they misrecognize the knowledge of the populations that we're talking about today. It may be that the populations are small or the phenomena too localized. That is, it is overlooked or marginalized as unimportant. It may be also that it's not a salient topic, nor the population influential enough to be given consideration nor participation. This may be because there is an active desire to exclude or keep the influence or knowledge as marginal, or it may be because there is not little convergence of interest with those who are garnering power in this divided context. So what questions might we pose for academic research? Well, that's part of the point of our interaction today. So I don't want to overshadow this really before we begin, but I'll point out some ideas. Research questions may be about complex issues, they may be about good practices, they may be about problems, they really do vary. But I'll start off perhaps speaking as a person who is a researcher of academic research with an awareness of blind spots of academia, but also as a migrant academic and a migrant person, mother, and partner from a country facing environmental impacts of climate change, South Africa, where there is catastrophic drought in the area that I come from, but also generations of conflict and oppression, in part due to colonial expansion and the continued capitalist interest in the plunder of raw materials such as gold and diamonds. So the ideas that I'm sharing are informed by this background, but I'm sharing them in that spirit rather than by informed findings. Some of what I'm sharing is also ideas that were highlighted in prior talks held by the think tank. So there's been so much talk about COP, environmental concerns with climate change, the amazing protests we've seen in the last few years and last few months, interest in cities in Northern Ireland, such as Belfast, being a smart city and addressing these concerns, the Sustainable Development Goals. All of that is happening. And at the same time, there has been awareness raising in campaigns that the Global South and those of the Global South are often excluded or marginalized in these talks, though many of those countries bear the brunt of the unsustainable practices of resource-rich countries. Many migrants and ethnic minorities in Northern Ireland are descendants of those from the Global South, or directly from the Global South, and effectively part of what is now being termed the excluded North. What does the participation of Northern Irish migrants and ethnic minorities reveal about global environmental justice? Is there evidence through their active participation within Northern Ireland discussions and actions and forums that those within the mainstream of Northern Ireland are aware or interested in addressing the root causes of environmental injustice? What are the patterns of participation of those discussions And what do they reveal about the involvement of migrants and ethnic minority members and the perceptions of the worth of their involvement? As an educationalist, I wonder, is there more need for sustainable education to raise awareness of this? How much does sustainability education or global development education bring back the global injustices to show how they relate to local communities and dynamics? How do we lift this pedagogical discussion from our formal educational institutions into public discourse? Then, looking narrowly at formal education institutions from a slightly different angle, what influence does the strategic thinking of those with limited resources and little intergenerational wealth and traction here, such as many migrants, have on the types of subjects that families choose for their children at school and university, and the types of engagements and battles that they choose in the public domain, including environmental ones? And how might this change over the generations and dependent on the country of origin? And then some other topics to consider. What about land? The relationships to land, right of access, movement, ownership, and settlement, a concern of the traveler community and of migrants too. The owning of farms and being a farmer in a country which was described to me as about intergenerational inheritance still, and the changing of hands that primarily sits with the family. Or the natural environment and how it relates to belief systems, mythologies, identities, and languages, even medicinal practices, and how these change over times, are retained or persist. What then about the double consciousness and double lives that Northern Irish migrants and ethnic minorities experience and navigate in relation to the effects of environmental change in the different parts of the globe to which they belong? This could include their ecological thinking and commitments, their engagement with policy, practice, behaviors, and attitudes in the different contexts. It could include the support for relief, including remittances and philanthropic work, in trade and political influence, which we as migrants often exhibit for our home regions and persons due to our environmental ethics, due to catastrophes, degradation, etc. But what about the awareness and stories of movement, of loss, opportunities in relation to environmental factors between places? How does this change over generations? How is it shared with mainstream locals and other migrant and ethnic minority groups and individuals? What agency and solidarities do migrants and ethnic minorities have in the different spaces? So these are just some thoughts inspired in part by what I learned from this mapping exercise and my conversations since being here in Northern Ireland for the past 4 years, an admittedly really short period of time. The knowers or experts on this broad topic are clearly, to my mind, not those of us who are sitting within universities, but those who are negotiating this terrain on a daily basis. So I look really forward to hearing from you all today. And thank you so much to everybody who's online for your time here.
Thank you to Dr. Dina Bellucci, my fellow colleague at the MME think tank and also at Queen's University, for that presentation on the gap of minority ethnic communities and migrants in the discussions of the environment. And today we're to look at the proactive contributions, look at good environmental practices, and share our insights. I'm delighted to welcome you to Dr. Christopher Stange, who is the General Counsel of St. Vincent and Grenadines, and he came into effect in November 16, 2017. Christopher Stange has had a wide range of experiences, and he is responsible for promoting the interests of foreign and trade policies of St. Vincent's and Grenadines and consular matters. His assignments include investment, trade, exchanges, procurement, and donation of supplies, equipment, and consumables. And that's for the St. Vincent and Grenadines, as well as many specific projects. So I welcome you to Dr. Christopher Stange. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for this opportunity. I think it's a wonderful engagement and platform. I think what happens is there tends to be a very disconnect with a lot of the newer citizens that are in Northern Ireland, what we call the diaspora or the ethnic minority community, and linking up. We're coming from obviously bringing experiences, but there's a lot that can be actually focused around climate change and the environment. I think Eileen has a few questions for me. I think we're going to do it that format if that works okay. So I'll get you to ask the questions and then I can feed in if that's okay.
If we see us okay, yes.
Yes.
Yeah, just to check here. Okay. Really interesting to hear about your contributions in the General Counsel and for St. Vincent the Grenadines. So what could we do better to make better contributions to environmental concerns from your experiences?
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the things that we all need, and it's a big issue, is food. We all need food every day. And obviously global food security is a big thing. But what a lot of people don't realize is their experience is they just go to the supermarket and they lift things off the shelf. And there's not really any more thought process on how that's actually produced or the sustainability behind it, or is there environmental damage. But not only that, is that mostly all the tropical commodities, because we can't grow them here in Northern Ireland, come from the global south, the developing world. And when you actually think of it from that perspective, looking at things like, for example, like fair trade, ethical labeling goes a great way to actually tick all these boxes, because what happens is fair trade under the ethical labeling, and Northern Ireland is actually been achieved as a fair trade country now in a devolved region. A lot of work has been put in here by government all the way down to the private sector, everyone. But it's through ethical consumerism that we're actually tackling a lot of these bigger issues like climate change, like child exploitation, using, exploiting human labor, and obviously damaging the environment. So underneath the fair trade label, that's one thing that we can all do, which is a very easy thing to do, is to commit during your weekly shop to actually look for the fair trade certification, and to do that, because again, climate change is a big thing. And if we don't look after our partners in the developing world and all the things that we readily consume every day and take for granted, we're not going to have those products come our way. And we're going to have a lot of issues with global food supply and obviously production. So that's one issue. I think obviously the people that are in Northern Ireland can also play a role through this format and other things in playing their civic responsibility and engaging in these discussions, because when you come from that country, you realize on the ground, or maybe you have family members, or maybe yourself, you've worked in that situation in agriculture. But when you look at most of the global south, the two main industries and economies are agriculture and tourism, and climate change is a really issue for that.
Yeah, I remember when I first met you, Christopher, and you were working in fair trade. You talked about food production. So what are you currently working with in terms of fair trade at the moment?
Yeah, well, fair trade, what we're doing is that we've established an all-party group on fair trade, which really runs the program for Northern Ireland. But to give you a perspective of what's been achieved here is that we're only the third region in the world that's achieved this status. So Scotland and Wales have achieved it, but we've achieved it here completely actually under a voluntary capacity. There was no funding, there was nothing put in. So it's actually gone to the highest level, and there's a lot of people that are behind us. There's also a lot of familiar faces around the room that have been involved in some aspect of it. So it's nice to see these people again. But one of the things with fair trade and what we're aiming to do is that what we have currently done is that every one of your councils across Northern Ireland is committed, has passed a motion. Same thing in all our 9 government departments. But we have basically standards put in that actually from the government side of it and from business and from workplaces and restaurants, et cetera, that we try to obviously supply the uptake of fair trade certification. And we're always trying to expand the labeling and access for farmers. But it's a system that works. It's a gold standard. It has complete traceability from the actual farm field to the supermarket shelves, and people have complete confidence in it. And if we didn't, we wouldn't see sales, doubling every year. But I think we need to go a little bit further than this, is that, it's not just doing a good turn. It's really getting people to actually take that conscious exercise of actually thinking about actually how their food is produced and the people that produce it for them. Because again, it's very easy to buy something off the supermarket shelves, but you don't have that direct relationship. You might not ever meet that farmer, but actually using the systems and mechanisms that are in place, you have the confidence that you're actually doing and you're actually satisfying a lot of the things. I encourage people off the COP26 is, again, read the summary document. It's a couple pages. But if you want to see really every country in the world, and from our perspective, and we had representation there, we have, nationally determined contributions. But to have a look at that summary statement and to see what's happening around the world and actually how you fit in as a global citizen, I think that's a very important exercise. One other important exercise is to look at the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. You'd be quite surprised actually how many people have never even seen the goals or actually how they fit in. And they're actually quite an empowering statement. And they're actually for all countries in the world, and every country has signed up to this. So again, your role that you can play as a global citizen, again, these small changes that we can all make, that's how we actually get through things.
Very true. We talk about global citizens. In Northern Ireland, surprisingly, we have over 90 languages represented. So I would say there's 90 types of minority ethnic communities and cultures and backgrounds here. How could they be more involved in this, for example, the fair trade movement? Because many of us must come from those countries.
Yeah.
Are we connected to it? Are we collaborating with you?
Yeah, and again, we can look at it now. Again, at every council level, there is a fair trade steering group, and it's open to anyone. If you go on to any of the council websites, there's an actual contact officer that leads as administration on that. You're always welcome to join these groups and the meetings. Unfortunately, during COVID and like today, we're doing everything virtually, but we hope in the near future we'll get back to. But everyone is entitled to join in that. But again, you can play your small step, even just buying things and looking for that certification mark. But I think what would be most useful, again, this is a start and it's a platform, but there's other useful things that could come to mind. It might be actually useful, and this wouldn't be my place to do, but having an all-party group on the environment up at Stormont, to lobby your politicians and to put in the framework and whatever else. I need to be very careful as a diplomat. I can lobby and I can say things, but I really don't have any comment. It needs to be led by the civic leadership and stuff here. But I think that's one platform that would be very useful. But I think the experience that we have around the table and the peace and stability that we have in Northern Ireland, and we have a lot of academic research, I think it's just pulling everything together and having a more cohesive approach to things where we can have these discussions. Because again, climate change is real, people. It's happening. There's no country that's immune to this. It's happening at different stages. And again, food is one of the biggest issues that, we need to have a sustainable environment. But when you look at everything else around the world, we're having more and more damage, from the perspective in the Caribbean. And even, when you have things, we're having more typhoons, we're having more hurricanes, we're having more tropical storms every year. This week, we've had flooding in Canada, which was unseen before. There is a real element in change here. And again, this is a big, big issue, but we need to actually bring down the global temperature and greenhouse gases. It's a real thing. We're seeing in the Caribbean, we're seeing new species of fishes that are actually coming in. We're seeing new algae grow up on our actual beaches. These are actually new problems, but they're only coming because the sea temperature is rising. So, there's a much, much bigger world out there rather than just sitting kind of in your bubble and watching things from a first-rate country. Whereas, we all actually play a role in this. And again, it's not about giving things to people. It's about creating partnerships and creating about as a global citizen and your role that you can play in this world and making it better for everyone. Because again, no community or country is immune to these problems.
Yeah, thank you. And you talked about the global citizen. The last question with maybe is around diversity. I'm an advocate for diversity. And yes, on that point of diversity, how can we have more diverse group of people or diverse communities being more involved? And what action would you suggest for that, given that we have this biodiversity? We all lived in it, it's all our roles and all our parts, but what one main action would you leave us with that we could all work with together?
I think discussions, a conference at some stage, would be very, very useful to engage. There already is, and a lot of people in this room would be, engaging with, the ethnic minority groups. I think, there's things that are happening and there's great action and great platforms within Northern Ireland, but they're not joined up. There's standalone, niche things or discussions that are happening. And again, when you talk about climate change, yeah, fair trade is an element of that. It can be standalone on its own, but you also have all the ethnic minority communities, you have music, you have, different cultures, you have different experiences, you have best practices out there in agriculture, you have technical assistance, you have programs. I think it's trying to pull this all together. And I know I'm trying to make this, not a monster of an experience, but I think you can start by actually bringing 2 or 3 groups together to have discussions and to actually grow the platform from that stage, and eventually actually develop this into, linking into the councils, all the 11 councils and central government, and having a platform to feed in that way. I think that's the way to have it. As long as dialogue is happening and there's discussions, we'll move forward. The problem is that when people are not having the discussions and just actually leaving it to a vacuum, nothing's going to happen. And these actual problems that we have are not going to go away. We can't bury our head in the sands. We need to basically make a conscious effort and to play our part and get involved.
Finally, what is your action for yourself, Christopher?
What I would like to do is, again, we're doing this already through the consulate, is we would engage with a lot of, groups. But again, we would like to be involved in what we can. Our job and experience, I can provide it from a Caribbean perspective and support. But again, it's just having those discussions and meetings. I think that's hard. And COVID's been the most difficult thing because we haven't been able to meet in person. I'm a real people person. I like to have face-to-face meetings. Being behind a screen and stuff, it's useful. It's served a purpose. There's maybe some good positivities that we can take away from that. But again, nothing beats face-to-face interaction and meeting those people and having those discussions. All right.
Great way to finish. Thank you.
Thank you so much. No, thank you so much. And thank you so much for having me. Enjoy your afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you. And as Christopher had said, it is great to meet face to face. We have a number of us here at the Lanyon building, and great to see everybody else on screen today. So I'm going to pass you on to the next part. We have a video here that will highlight the local community activism that's happening between Northern Ireland and the Philippines. And after that, can I just introduce you quickly to Darren Ferguson, because he's going to help with the questions in the next part. Darren, would you like to come here?
I'll do a quick hello here because we've so many wonderful speakers lined up. So after our next guest, we'll ask some questions, and then I'll speak to you later on about some of the work I'm involved in this as well. But I hope you're enjoying it. And if you get a bit of screen fatigue, don't feel free to turn off your screens as well. So if you just want to take a moment out with everybody looking at you, so that's okay to do that. Okay, thanks.
Okay, so enjoy this next video. Thank you.
I have lived here for the last 20 years now. I work for the community, like volunteer. Sometimes I volunteer with Ian here.
I'm the founder of 10 Foundations. We're a Northern Ireland charity registered here in Northern Ireland, but we work obviously in the Philippines.
In Philippines and in the everywhere in the world, we feel like we have the responsibility to respond or to act on that time. In the Philippines, we have this Bayanihan culture. Bayanihan means everybody helping each other. As a girl growing up in the Philippines, in the small village in the Philippines, I see all this disaster or devastation firsthand. And being here and seeing all those videos and the reports on the media, we feel like, as all other Filipinos, that we also have the responsibilities on it. And here in Northern Ireland, during those times, our community has had responded to it by doing our own fundraising to individuals like us, putting balikbayan, which is a box. We put all this box all together, fill them with canned goods, clothes that we don't need anymore, getting our neighbors to ask our neighbors if they have spare clothes that they don't need anymore, put them all in the box. And it's actually bring us all together as a community, as a Filipino community, to help our brothers and sisters in the Philippines suffering during those time of calamities of Typhoon Haiyan.
Were you there when the typhoon happened?
I was indeed, Eileen. I was there. It just happened to coincide with a group of volunteers coming from Ireland, and I was there the week before they arrived, and that was whenever Typhoon Yolanda or Haiyan struck. We couldn't be in the Philippines at that time and not do something, and we went to the island of Panay, where there was, I think, 400,000 people displaced, and we did what we could, which was, they needed any help at all that they could get at that time.
How did people feel here when they saw those areas affected in the Philippines?
It was so heartbreaking, especially with all the poverty that was already felt before this calamities strikes us. So we already have that poverty, and that time you can imagine how people from that region suffered.
There was a certain slogan, no typhoon is stronger than the Filipino spirit.
Yeah.
No
in
typhoon.
other words, it's a resilience of Filipino during the time of hardship, of calamities, that nothing can come between that spirit, that unity spirit, that Bayanihan spirit, which is a big thing. Bayanihan is a beautiful Filipino culture that says, we can come together to help. There's not a big thing that can come between us.
Whenever I would go mainly to primary schools, and we have a lovely little presentation we do, and it's about global citizenship, fair trade, the world around us, PDA, personal development, mutual understanding. And I find that the primary school kids especially, they just get it. They really love it, and they love the fact that a child living in Northern Ireland can see the difference. So it's a really, really positive impact, and you can see the benefit, and you can see the kids here really responding to that, especially the primary school kids.
Coming to Northern Ireland altogether is a different story, but there is no such. The best thing about here is there's no typhoon. There's not a calamity that would, affect our livelihood.
So there's a lot of talk about climate action. What action do you think would help?
Simple thing, just it's not as simple as what I'm saying. I was talking to a taxi driver yesterday, and he was talking about the global warming, how countries that has islands could get affected by the global warming, that some of these islands will sink, because of the ice melting in our Antarctic. And I was thinking they're talking about the countries like Philippines. We have like 7,107 islands. And I'm thinking about how the global warming could sink all those wee islands where people are living. And I have no answer for that at the minute. But whatever our government will be doing, I could just say that we have to support it. That is how we can help.
It's the people, as far as I'm concerned, that make it. And the Filipino community here is very, very supportive over the years with 10 foundations. They support us in many ways. We've just opened a shop here in Castle Court doing sustainable fashion, which is very trendy nowadays. And if we can keep that going, it's a great way of earning money.
I come from the Bagubo community, which is one of the ethnic minorities back in the Philippines, where we have our forefathers who owned the lands. Little by little, we lost our lands, we lost our identities. So right now, my wish would be to have somebody in our government that could give the ethnic minorities what we are supposed, justice, like just give us back our lands, or at least give us a share of what we lost.
But what does the land mean to you? What does it do for you?
Because the land is the one. The land give us food. The land give us this, our livelihood. So to lose that to the capitalist or rich people is, you can imagine how it is the devastation would do to the poor people.
Because I remember at one stage you talked about even the rice paddy fields, and it has its own special Filipino dance. So there's a lot of it connected to your own culture as well.
which is the modern world, bit by bit vanishes that, that culture.
Yeah.
Because we will have, it was a spirit for the community as well that time, because community gathered together, we plant our rice paddies, and it was like
Family.
gathering for the community gathering.
Yeah.
And then bit by bit it all being vanished if we don't do anything about it.
So
so we have to highlight that. I have to highlight that.
Yes.
And I as a one of the Bagobo community, from Bagobo community, would be the voice. I'm just one of the voice, but if you you have to make it alive to, so it's our responsibility, each of us.
There we are. We are short for time, so before we speak, hear from Anna. So I just have a guest I want to introduce you to very quickly here, and just ask a quick question. Can you tell me who you are and a bit of your connection with what we've just seen there?
Yeah, I'm Indira Abdullah. I'm one of the staff nurses in Royal Victoria Hospital, and also one of the staff in the Filipino community organization called Puso NI. So I'm the secretary in that.
Yeah. I was doing my homework about the Philippines, because I think with all of the climate change stuff, it's really turned us to give a really better understanding of our global neighbours, which is really important. And I never knew it was over 7,600 islands within the Philippines. And the risk index, it's kind of shifted from 4 to 9. It's a really high risk country. I think given what's happened recently with COP26, and it seems to be a big movement now against climate change, locally, have you noticed a change in attitudes regarding how people see our global neighbours, especially the Philippines, to be high at risk and those types of islands? It's going to be most effective. Have you seen a change in attitudes at all?
Yes, of course. I've noticed changes and all. I think people now are starting to get more empathic and more compassionate and being considerate of the other places. All we're getting more aware of what is going on already, because there was so many devastations already as we have seen before in 2013, which was really one of the greatest devastation that the Philippines has undergone.
And then obviously connection with your community back in the Philippines as well. I mean, regarding their fears towards the impact of climate change, is it really real fears of what's going on there?
That's right. In Philippines, because of our geographical location, we are very prone to all these typhoons and all. And as I said, the biggest and the strongest ever that we could remember, it was the Haiyan or the Yolanda in Philippines. We term it as Yolanda typhoon, and it was really the most devastating event that it really had not just affected them, but also us in outside Philippines. All Filipino communities outside the Philippines were very, very much affected, because we have families and all as well there, and we were very, very devastated during those times.
Yeah. Well, let's hope there's going to be a big shift that will change things.
Well,
How
hopefully.
hopeful are you of that?
Well,
that change?
I'm hopeful, but you know what? With all these pandemic things as well going on, and as I said, the Haiyan during that time was caused by the tropical cyclones, and we know that it's through the global warming and all. And with this pandemic thing going on as well, that we have everything should be disposable. It seems to be really not helping with the global warming and everything. So it's really becoming very responsible for what we are having, and be mindful of the effect, not only for us presently, but for the next generation as well. And whatever the effect in our environment, it has to go hand in hand together.
Okay. Thank you for your time.
Thank
Thank
you
you.
so much.
I think we're going to just now to Anna. I think we're going to move on to now, are we, Eileen? I think Anna's joined us virtually. You should be there in virtual world somewhere, Anna. If we hand it over to you.
My name's Anna Clarke. I'm the Director of Prospect Awards, which is a learning design and development agency, social enterprise based in Northern Ireland, in Magherafelt. And it's a community development, learning design and development agency. That's the focus of our work here. And that involves running a lot of community development training, facilitation, leadership programs for community organisers and community leaders, community research and social action type projects, and evaluation of programs that are run as well. I'm also president of the International Association for Community Development, which is, as it says, an international organisation. We have a board of directors from, there's 20 of us from different global regions around the world. And again, the focus of our work and the purpose of the organisation is to promote and support the discipline of community development. I've worked with a variety of different community organisations across Northern Ireland. Some of the work that we've been involved in with Eileen and Clarke NI has been to support an Erasmus project that was a trans-European initiative to develop a training programme for cultural diversity trainers, and we were absolutely delighted to be involved in that over the last couple of years, working with Eileen and the project partners from Turkey, Greece, Italy, Scotland, as well as here in Northern Ireland. Some of the other organisations and groups that I've worked with in terms of Prospect Awards in Northern Ireland has been with minority ethnic groups in the ABC area, specifically the Banbridge area. That was a piece of community-based research. Worked with other organisations in different parts of the north in relation to broader pieces of work, but particularly seeking to ensure that people from minority ethnic communities, their views, their experiences, and the issues and needs that they experience as well are reflected in those aspects of community-based research. And then obviously in terms of participation around education and training programmes, again around community development, but also specifically in some instances around promoting participation. From a community development point of view, what I think is really important is that whilst people need help and support to understand the systems and structures that exist within, a particular country or an environment, might be, simply around health. How does health function in Northern Ireland, for example? How do I access it, and what are the mechanisms around all of that? But from a community development point of view, it is also it is about empowering people so that it's not a transactional relationship all the time. Can you do this for me? But actually that people develop the knowledge and the understanding and the confidence to be able to engage and articulate as independent, individuals and members of the community, and certainly in a way that will help and support the development of their own community, however they may define that, whether it's geography or, sort of a community of identity. So it's also about working with people in a way that isn't just about yes, I can help you with that. I can get that appointment for you, or I can give you that advice about what you must do. It's also about ensuring that the knowledge and the understanding is supported there to build that empowerment or empowering process as well. I think there's a lot of activity happening in Northern Ireland. There are some, sort of regional organisations that have very specific, specifically focused remits around the environment, and then at a local level, there's a growing number, and a lot of that is probably very much also supported through the development of a wellbeing agenda too. So the kind of the complementarities and the synergies there. So for example, a lot of community growing projects are addressing a lot of mental health and wellbeing issues and factors, but at the same time also looking at ways in which they're supporting the local environment and building awareness around the value of organic farming, for example, or the planting of indigenous trees and shrubs that are better for our environment here than imports, and so all those kinds of things are very much part and parcel, interwoven into a lot of the organisations that I've been working with over a number of years. On an international level, we have a number of members of IACD who have very specific sort of interests in the environment, and some of that might be from an environmental biodiversity interest. So, for example, marine focused, particularly island communities. Others might be very much around climate action and climate justice. So they're more campaign, more lobbying orientated around specific issues, whether it's to do with air quality or pollution. So that it's really wide and varied. And the breadth is obviously very interesting. What's really important is the fact that all of them are collectively involved in seeking to also raise that awareness within a wider community of the importance of the environment and climate action, and how people can be involved in that process at a local level, as well as what's needed, a policy level. I think, when we talk about policymakers, we could literally be talking about world leaders right the way through to our local councils or other statutory bodies that, have a remit to make decisions about certain fields, whether it's housing or health, roads, the built infrastructure, and for all of them, I think it's absolutely critical that we, and this was a feature of IACD's statement for COP26, that we, we demand really that all leaders take on board the outcomes of COP26, but go beyond that as well, and actually really commit to the targets that have been set, and recognise that the impacts on people and on communities are differential. The environment currently is a global crisis, but it impacts differentially on different communities. And regardless of where leaders are and policymakers are, I think that recognition of the global nature of this crisis is absolutely critical. So we need to really campaign and lobby for the highest degree of action possible across all policy arenas. And that means integrating that into absolutely every area of policy. In many respects, I think we need to start thinking about the climate as another protected category in the same way legislatively that we do around other protected categories that we have, for example, in Northern Ireland. Section 75. So we need legislative protection for the environment at all levels. It needs to be integrated in all areas of policy. And that also there is a strong body of support for public awareness raising and education around the crisis that we're in and what we need to do collectively to address and mitigate the impacts of that. What happens a lot of the time is that sustainability or environment is something that gets added in as an aspirational, desire into policy documents. And what we really need to see is that reflected in stronger legislation that is about it being protected at all levels. So if we think about equality, for example, that's reflected in legislation, but it's also, government departments, statutory agencies are required to report. And I think we're at a point, and we're probably way beyond the point where we really do need to see that level of protection for the climate and the environment as well.
All right, it's hard to see on the screen here if we're on mute or not. We're going to take a very unusual music accompanied comfort break here at our side here in Queens. So this is a 5-minute music video if you want to relax for a while. It's actually with musicians around 22 countries, inspired by a John Cage piece called 433. So the musicians are not actually playing music, it's the environment around them, which is actually the soundtrack. So 5 minutes of music with no music, the environment being the soundtrack, and we'll come back after that short break. Thank you. That was that's on YouTube actually, 4:33 for Music Day, with a pair of headphones on. You can hear all the environmental sounds, and that was the idea from John Cage, the composer, of all the sounds that surround us, where it's the birds tweeting, the sound of the car, the sound of the air conditioning. You can hear the sound of each country. You're going to hear music now. So the organisation I work for, Beyond Skin, we've done a lot of stuff with our global neighbours, especially Colombia. It was quite interesting actually when we had people from Colombia over Northern Ireland, and one gentleman in particular was amazed and very confused when we took him around various kind of Catholic and Protestant areas, trying to get his head around our conflict here, people fighting over it's British soil or Irish soil. And his simple question is, well, if we're fighting over the soil, why aren't they looking after it? So I thought that was very interesting. Colombia being the most second most biodiverse country in the world. When I visited a number of times, I was amazed to see the kind of reconciliation with the land that was going on there. So the video you're about to see is a lot of influence from Colombia, working with young people here in Northern Ireland virtually over the summer. So I'll get Morris McCartney, who's doing a fine job here in the Lecture Theatre, of queuing up all these videos. I'll get him to show that video, and I'll just say a brief words after that video. Thank you.
Como grupo hemos asumido el desafío de usar la música como una herramienta para enviar un mensaje que aliente a las personas a reutilizar. Como ven, mi guitarra, a la que llamamos guitarrín, está formada por partes de un rin de un carro y una guitarra abandonada. Y miren cómo suena.
Dice que debemos reciclar. ¿Cuy? Ok, mi gente, compañeros, compañeras, lo que acaban de escuchar es un tambor construido con materiales reutilizables. Can you feel it? Qué swing, brother. Esto es puro swing de Cali, papá.
We are orchestra of change.
Give me love, give me love.
We work for a better place.
Come on, come on.
1, 2, 3.
Yo soy cuerpos gramaticales.
Yo soy cuerpos gramaticales.
Yo soy cuerpos gramaticales.
Yo soy cuerpos gramaticales.
Yo soy cuerpos.
Es otra forma de decir que no le tememos al sonido de un fusil, pues nos pueden matar y aquí vamos a seguir alzando la voz de aquello que nos tocó ver morir. Somos la voz del niño que habla desde el más allá, que hoy grita justicia y no lo...
So a couple of videos there from two projects. One was with Mr. Clarke in Colombia, which is a band using recycled instruments. And they did a lot of virtual workshops over the summer period there with young people in the Mid-Ulster area. Just looking at more about the kind of the waste around us and how you can actually make music with objects that we dispose of. I was actually at a recycling plant there the other day. I was just horrified to see the amount of electronics that had been discarded, and I really like the idea of the PlayStation, the Sony PlayStation being turned into a bass guitar. So it's things like that. And the second project, again, coming from Colombia, translated as a song of life, is where the actual physical act, and it was mostly focused on women, is where they're kind of they are planted in the ground from the waist down, and it's symbolic in many ways regarding especially people who have migrated to Northern Ireland as they're planting their roots here. It's a process of healing, a process of protest as well, and it's a very deep connection with the land. So I think it's learning from, I mean, this example from Colombia, but what we found very beneficial as an organisation is finding what's happening around the world, as we've all been under kind of coronavirus restrictions, a lot of people around the world have had restrictions in many different ways, whether you're in the Gambia and the electricity's going off every couple of hours. I mean, people work around it and are doing amazing things. And I think we have to look at our global neighbours and see what they are doing and things that are way ahead of us in doing as well, regarding our connectivity, regarding taking care of ourselves, our planet, our sense of belonging, and our connectivity again with our global neighbours and how it affects local relations as well. So that was two very quick examples there. I'm going to pass you on to a good friend who I have a lot of admiration for as well, Shaolano, who's been doing loads of stuff. And actually, a very quick story, we were trying to meet up for years in Northern Ireland because she's just not that far from me here. And we could never get round of it. And actually, we actually met in Bogota, Colombia by accident one year. So I'm going to hand over to Sharo now and also Izzy Boyd to lead the next presentation for you. Thank you.
I'm Izzy. My name's Ishel, but I like to be called Izzy. And my friend Charo and Anna Moretti Stewart, we started Zero Waste Mid Ulster. That was November 2019.
Can you see that? That's beautiful, no? The mountains and the town.
So my name is Mar del Rio, and some people call me Charo. Lanao Flores, and I was born in this land where I am right now. I am in Peru. My ancestors are from the mountains, from the Andes, and I was born beside the Pacific Ocean. My adopted land is the island of Ireland, and I'm very happy there. And I'm also very happy coming back to where I was born, not only to meet people actually, but to meet the land. One thing that I believe is that when we are born from a father and a mother, but also there is a father and a mother on nature. So the belief here is that the biggest mountain is sort of the father, and the water is the mother. So so it's important to come and visit and connect and reconnect with that energy.
We all were very interested in looking after the environment, and we were always like very trying to do our very best with what we can. And then Charo mentioned something about the Zero Waste Northwest, and we thought, well, even though it's not that far, like why wouldn't we have something more local? And so we said, let's start this. So the idea was to start a very small shop, but more than a shop itself, it was the general idea was we want to be like a hub in which we wanted to bring people together to change this mindset, to come into this idea of we can do something. Because I suppose most people get the idea of no, there's no point because we won't make any difference. If I recycle, it won't make any difference. Whereas we believe that we do.
So my background is in rural sociology. And then I was able to go and work in the Amazon rainforest, the part that actually links between Peru, Bolivia, and Brazil. And I was living with different communities along the border. And one of the things that for me was really important to understand is that nature doesn't have borders. The animals don't know about borders. The rivers don't know about borders. So it was that element of, and especially people, indigenous people that were living between, in this case, Peru, Bolivia, and Brazil. Borders was like a geographical concept.
We started with this idea of having workshops and trying to encourage more people and to connect with other people. So we were talking to different people doing different things. For example, Vicky, that she runs the recycling for Kicks Count, which is a lovely program. So we were trying to do something like that. Then we were talking to Zero Waste Northwest to learn about their journey and what can we do. And so they gave us a lot of insight and it was very helpful. And then So we did our research as well. So we discovered products that we wanted to have. So we started our pop-up shop in February 2020, which didn't last long because then lockdown came.
While I was there, and my work was actually to support the communities to organize about, especially to understand, Indigenous people didn't know about legislation, formal legislation that was coming actually from the government. And at that moment, Shell, the company Shell, found that there was gas on that part of the country. And the role that I was having there, which I learned, was to facilitate the dialogue. So everybody was having like an equal say and an equal understanding of what was happening. And as we know, in many places, I mean, not only here in Peru, but in many places, I mean, in Ireland, when you don't have access to information, how could you participate in an equal level?
We had last Earth Day, we had a virtual summit in which we were talking to different people and try to see what they're doing and try to, like let people know locally what's happening and what are we doing and what can we do, how can we collaborate, how can we start shifting into this idea of being more responsible the way we consume. And Christmas 2019, we took the pop-up shop to a couple of Christmas fairs and tried to say, look, first of all, you don't have to buy a lot of things, but if you are adamant you want to buy something for Christmas, we'll try to do that in a more sustainable way. So go to the charity shop or use the Facebook Market or just swap with your friends.
The work that I do in Northern Ireland, actually, it's pretty much connected with global education, which is basically understanding how we are all interconnected and how every action counts. This is important. It's like how we are active citizens and how we are all part of the solution or part of the problem. Depend how do you want to see that.
But I think we should reduce the focus on recycling and increase the focus on reuse and just stop using reducing what you actually buy. I don't think we need to have this constant I need to buy because we don't need that, and we are the problem. We are making the problem bigger. So this is what I would like to focus here West Mid Ulster in trying to share this insight of we don't need to buy more, we need to reduce. And if you're going to buy, well, just reuse, buy something that already is there. And most of the time it's much better quality when you go to a charity shop and get something from there or a library of things. And something that I really miss is like going to we used to have lots of different shops in which you would bring your own containers, or even you had a man in his bike bringing you like cleaning products or sharpening your tools and things like that, or fixing your shoes. I remember the first time I moved here and I wanted to fix my shoes. People looked at me like, why would you? And I actually took my shoes to a shoe repair, and the repairing cost me a lot more than the shoes did. So I thought, okay, this is, but I think it's because people are not as used to repair things as in the past.
What I learn every time I come here, and I learn so much from, I learned so much from the perspective on the how is the connection with Mother Earth. I mean, like that, it's very powerful for me anyway. For me, that really helps me to sustain. I actually really get held by Mother Earth.
So Zero Waste is going to do that at some point, the library of things. But again, we are still trying to find a space to put that. And we are going to be in markets, Christmas markets, just with a couple of things, a very small pop-up shop. But it's more like to show Christmas decorations ideas and how to wrap your presents, and trying to encourage people to stop using glitter, please. Pretty please.
When people ask me, so who do you work with? I'm like, I work for Mother Earth. She sends me here and she sends me there. So I really ask for that energy. So if you ask me, what is that I bring? I mean, I bring that in the way I do things. And of course, the other thing in a more practical way is, and that is one of the reasons why we started at Zero Waste in the Mid-Ulster, is that the belief that we can all do something. But I think one important thing is that you take care of what you know and what you love. So I think that one thing that I hope I'm bringing to Northern Ireland is to encourage people to walk in the beautiful forest. I mean, the island of Ireland is absolutely so beautiful. I mean, really beautiful. I am so honored to have been adopted by that land.
So we've had a wonderful afternoon here so far from Charo and Izzy have put us in the mood for adopting our land, enjoying it, and yeah, I always think about the forests and everything. Darren's video there at the beginning had us all confused because we kept on saying no sign, no sign. But what it was, it's a bit like the Robert Frost poem. It's like stopping by woods on a snowy evening when you actually stop and you enjoy what you have around you. So it's so important to do that and look at the examples we've got from land, from our home. So home for many of us doesn't just mean Northern Ireland, but also the countries where our parents are from, our grandfathers are from, and so on and so forth. But look at the lessons that we can bring. So really encouraged by all this stuff about charity shops. I love charity shops. Ian Campbell has joined us. He's going to be here later on and to ask him questions about 10 foundations. He does sustainable fashion and he also does, recycling of bags. So you can always look good with Ian around, I can tell you. We're going to move on here. It's not always easy in working with the issues of the environment. And unfortunately, there's also issues around discrimination and around migration, racism. So I'm going to introduce you to Ulrika Vitten. Ulrika Vitten is part of the British-based group, Social Scientists Against Hostile Environment. She's a sociologist at the Queen's University, feminist and political activist in researching and publishing issues on the discrimination of visible minorities and citizens in different European societies. So I'll pass you on to Ulrika, who's joining us here by Sue.
So, hello everybody. I'm Ulrika Vitten, just introduced by Eileen, thanks for that. I feel a bit like one odd out, to be honest here. When Dino asked me and Fiona for a contribution, I felt I'm not really looking at the situation of Mother Nature or the natural environment. So not only because I'm a sociologist, but also in terms of where I come from in my discipline, my interest, rather looking at the social, cultural, political, and legal environment. So that's also why, perhaps as Eileen just introduced, the focus around migration in the UK specifically is in recent years on hostile environment. I will skip the discrimination that wasn't coined by me, that was a suggested title by the organizers. I rather would call or would talk about racism. But today I will just briefly make a connection between what the discourse on migration tells us and how it shifted. And the image you're just seeing is after 9/11, 2001, the destroyed globe, in a way suggesting that the utopian or utopian elements of cosmopolitanism of a global world were just disrupted and destroyed. Destroyed, question mark, because time is moving on and we might be also, and you will understand this later on in my last point I'm trying to make, there might be still hope. So the context of migration, and I'm just trying to raise awareness here that even the notion of who is labeled as a migrant shifted interestingly and remarkably in the last years. EU citizens, and of course, I'm an EU citizen, I'm now a migrant, EU migrant as well. So since the UK left the European Union, we had to apply for settled status. And so at least as far as the UK is concerned, we're now migrants, labor migrants. So, but apart from, let's say, a label of being a migrant, we, and if I say we, I mean me and Dr. Fiona Murphy, my colleague, we looked at the situation of asylum seekers and refugees in Northern Ireland. But what really becomes apparent in the last months, particularly, if you think of BBC or Channel 4 coverage of what's just happening, Belarus-Polish border, refugees are people who have fled war zones, environmental crisis, perhaps are labeled as migrants. So there's a shift, a remarkable shift in not even being able or willing to differentiate who might be or who might be counted here in different categories. Why is this important? It's important because it does have different legal consequences. There's a different status attached to this framework. So the hostile environment, and some of you might know this, it's in the UK, it's not only because it's about the social and the legal environment. The hostile environment refers to a series of policy measurements introduced by the then Home Secretary Theresa May in 2012. And it basically opened up a very strong and rigid distinction between people who have, let's say, a legal right to stay in the country and also who are then labeled as illegal. And through the Immigration Acts in 2014 and 2016, different measures were introduced controlling or checking whether individuals have a right to stay in the UK. And as my colleagues Nia Dovell-Davis, Georgie Weymouth, and Catherine Cassidy argued also in their book Bordering, the process of controlling and bordering, meaning everyday bordering, has expanded and extended to different institutions and different people. What does it mean? It means that if you are an employer, you have to check whether someone is legal in the country. If you work for the NHS, you have to check whether someone is legal in the country. Even me or us, as those working at the universities now for years, are asked also to check the status of the students, tier 4 students, so international students, Commonwealth students. We are drawn into a process of bordering. We become border guards, so to speak. And this is part and parcel of a very fundamental shift in the discourse, aiming to be restrictive on immigration and using also punitive measures to deter people from migrating to the country, but also aiming to create an unbearable living condition for illegal migrants. And some of you might remember this van. I'm now referring predominantly to a debate and discourse in Britain, the van where it basically was saying like, go home, and driving through parts of London with high percentage of immigrant communities / visible minorities / racialized minorities. Even if they would be British citizens, at least these parts of the city were targeted, which then again tells a story how marginalization and how racializing operates. And this hostile environment, of course, and I said like it started in 2012, so very, very clearly before 2016, the Brexit vote, the Brexit year, you remember, but it basically captures the mood and a shift in a discourse, particularly in Britain and the United Kingdom, but I'm now referring to Britain, becoming a more hostile environment. And this is very significant, as before, let's say in the 90s, early 90s, or even like in the early of the 21st century, Britain praised itself very proud to be cosmopolitan, to be inclusive, to be multicultural, to be a welcoming society. And only within, let's say, 10 years, amazingly or astoundingly, all these kind of histories and perspectives that were very much anchored in an understanding not only of a post-colonial society, to a certain degree, a society where post-colonial people would be allowed to come to the country, but gradually shifting the whole discourse about rights and who is legally or who is legally staying in the country. And you might remember the Windrush scandal of 2018, another example of how the shift, the dramatic shift in this discourse, but not only in the discourse, but also in terms of what it legally meant, impacted whole communities who were living and individuals who were living in the country for ages and never had to basically prove their legal right to stay. The whole debate again shifted, turned, and with dramatic and drastic implications. People died, people were not allowed to return to the country because they were just, let's say, visiting friends and family elsewhere, but they were basically not allowed to come back. So this form of hostile environment, and Eileen mentioned this already, is an issue that, I was too fast, sorry about this. I tried to go back. Yeah. You can look, or you can have a look at for yourself, Social Scientists Against Hostile Environment. That's a academic activist group, I would say. You might also call them public intellectuals. For years now, tackling and trying to tackle this implementation of a racist hostile environment in the UK. A report was produced. So if you go, for example, to the website, you will see there's a report. Since lockdown, since COVID-19 situation, meaning that since March 2020, lots of online events have been organized, or we have been organizing these events. It's continuing. All aspects in different ways, so cover problems arising from the marginalization of visible minorities and migrants. So it's not only about migrants, it's also about racialized visible minorities. In what ways also, for example, the COVID crisis is impacting their life, in what ways political debates also about racism and populism are relevant. The Brexit debate, I mean, you can have a look for yourself. The question then would be, in what ways does this hostile environment thing impact Northern Ireland? And my view is that on the one hand, living now in Northern Ireland since 2015, so quite a few years, that the perspective of the Northern Irish society, but also of the politics, is not one-to-one following this hostile environment discourse as it's dominant in Britain. That said, we're still waiting for the integration strategy, that what should have followed Fiona Murphy's and my study and report back then in 2018. I think the report was released in 2018. Since 2019, Stormont is back to business and nothing is happening in this area. So that's one thing that we have to take in mind, or we have to keep in mind, that there's still like a gap between, on the one hand, having funded research and there is outcome of research and it can be named, but a policy or the inadequacy of politics makers here not being really interested in translating this to strategies and putting money into it, to be honest. So The Immigration Act 2014 and 16, I mentioned that earlier, is equally impacting the life of refugees and asylum seekers, or let's call them vulnerable, legally vulnerable people in Northern Ireland, because though housing, education and health are on the one hand devolved matters, but any issue or topics that are related to immigration are centrally or are basically regulated by Westminster. So there's some kind of paradox or even a tension going on, that on the one hand, the dominance of this hostile environment / immigration acts is what's ruling into areas that usually would be an aspect or matter of devolved governments here in Northern Ireland. And so, as I said earlier, feeling a bit one-odd out, really fascinated by the talks and videos beforehand. I came across, in preparation of this, I came across a quote I used ages ago. So it's from Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. So, I mean, you can read it for yourself, but the kernel or the core argument is that, of course, there's a linkage between legislation, political, and if Marx and Engels were saying bourgeois prejudices and interests, property, we could say middle class or upper middle class interests. It's formative how and why legislation is implemented and how it's enacted and how regulation work. So we have to keep that in mind as it's framing also any kind of perspective that we can basically overcome the situation. And last not least, in that kind of context, as the speakers before were saying, if we're talking about recycling, if we're talking about making use of resources differently, then I would argue it's definitely very much against consumerism and it's against capitalism. So we have to basically also ask this capitalist question, so to speak. But then taking on board again that we now are in a situation of climate catastrophe. Some people would say climate crisis, and I think it's more than crisis. There's protest on the streets. There was this Congress or meeting in Glasgow. But in the end, what really matters, and that's my argument here, I took this pictures years ago when I was still living in London. The guy who's protesting in front of Westminster in empathy with people living in Iraq, with the kids and so forth. He died a couple of years ago and everything was not destroyed. What he did actually made it to an exhibition. But the argument would be that it's necessary nowadays even more to revisit cosmopolitan visions. And as I said, I just reading a quote from my book. I had a look at my book where I critiqued European discourses on cosmopolitanism ages ago. So my argument was that if we take into account feminist reading, feminist reading of subaltern cosmopolitanism, it offers an alternative frame that combines post-colonial critique as perspective from the South and critical knowledge in and across Europe with feminist transnational transversal inquiry. Some female gendered virtues of caring for the other lean to another side of boundary transitions. They imagine an even more inclusive view of cosmopolitan bond that appreciates nature, ecology, and children's rights. According to Sanchez Flores, nature and childhood are essential others to Western individuality, and it's urgent that we decipher where this othering comes from. The world of individuals lies on one pole, and that of nature, or those defined as close to nature, on the other. Women, children, and in inverted commas, barbarians have been readily placed by the Western liberal tradition of thought in the proximity of nature, and thus have been seen as essentially underdeveloped or worse, inferior. And I felt that's very much fitting to the whole discourse. We're talking about environment. So to finish here with some concluding remarks, that it's necessary also to engage with a more positive vision of inclusion and to be anti-capitalist. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ulrike, for that and your presentation on hostile environments. Very good concluding remarks and a lot of fuel for thought. I've never thought about that aspect of females, nature, childcare, where we're all involved in. So, Ulrike, are you staying for some questions later on? Yes.
So yeah, I stay until 5:30-ish.
Oh, great, thank you.
4:30, sorry, 4:30.
So I think at this stage, anybody who has any questions, probably just to get us prepared for near the end, is to put them into the chat so that we can see them as they come up. So if there's any questions for Ulrike's presentation or the ones before, or any thoughts, please put them in the chat. I will come back to those in a while. So we're going from hostile environments to, the people that are actually working as seasonal workers, and we have Dr. Roxana Barbares on video in a minute. She is a University Fellow in New Migrations in Europe and UK, the School of Sociology and Social Policy, University of Leeds. She's also my good colleague as a board trustee of the Europeans UK. So Morris will hit the button here and we will see Roxana.
I will present today some preliminary findings from a project that I've been working on for the past year. And this is a project looking at seasonal workers in particular in the agriculture sector and even more so in horticulture. And what we did when we set up the project, on which I work with many colleagues, and I have the great fortune to work with Carlos Vargas Silva from the University of Oxford, Bethany Robertson at Leeds, and we are also collaborating with an illustrator. So what is happening in the UK, and how has the situation of seasonal workers been handled through time? UK has brought in workers from overseas, migrants from overseas since the early post-war period. And the UK is not alone in bringing workers for agriculture. Most developed nations do. And one very well-known case, for example, is the US. There are differences in how this is organized. For example, the UK, something that UK does very well is to regulate the recruitment agencies who can bring workers. There's been considerable change, and I would even say radical change over the past few years. And this has to do with the fact that while in the past, seasonal workers were brought in through the visa system, so immigration, simple immigration or through the regular regime, as the freedom of movement, as UK joined the EU and was part of the freedom of movement, it started bringing workers from primarily Central and Eastern Europe, and that is still the majority of workers today in the sector, and through both means. So until 2013, we have a freedom of movement operating and then a parallel visa system, and the demand was met through these two pathways. In 2013, the visa system was stopped, came to a full stop, and the reason for that was that UK already could recruit direct employment from the EU. So freedom of movement became the only source of bringing workers, seasonal workers, to the UK. But last year, we also had the seasonal pilot, the seasonal worker pilot for 10,000 places were made available last year. And in addition, there was further efforts to recruit workers from Britain, British workers through, for example, you might have heard and come across the Pick for Britain campaign. in 2021, the situation changes drastically, and that is because freedom of movement ends in December, and farmers could then only recruit or bring workers with seasonal USS, and this could have been workers that only signed up for USS last year, and they only signed up for USS to return this year, not to remain in the UK. Today, we are in a situation when over 90% of the workers in farming are migrants who are either domiciliated in the UK with USS or have the USS, or are workers on the Tier 5 seasonal worker visa. The seasonal worker visa and the Tier 5 and the temporary visa route is the only sectorial-based visa in the UK immigration system after Brexit, and is the only route for what would be called as low-skilled migration. So this is really important, especially in the current context, when particularly this visa, the seasonal worker visa Tier 5, has been extended to bring in workers for lorry drivers, poultry workers, and butchers. It is exactly an extension of this visa system under the same rules and regulations with the same administrators of the visa. So it becomes even more critical to the immigration system as we encounter it today. So we found that 21% of the farmers we spoke to had their needs for seasonal workers met in 2021. But the majority report is 79% reported shortages. And just imagine any workplace, your workplace dealing with a shortage of 10, 20%. 20% was the most common one. And how would you reorganize budgets, investment activity? In response, we see that farmers are adapting, and as a result, one of the measures is to reduce production, which is quite a concern from the point of view of food security, but also the very survival of the sector and thriving, the progress of the sector. And it's tremendously sad because we've been speaking also with families that have had the farm for generations, and some are as old as the Tower of London. So there are very important questions to have here, and the industry often says you either import the workers or export the industry. But this is a serious concern. We are now in a situation where we have two very different types of workers. So I put here some testimonies from the workers that talk particularly about the physical hard labor aspect of this job. It's seasonal, so they have to have to have another income for the remainder of the year. And we find all sorts of that it fits and different roles in their lives. So, for example, we also spoke with a retired person from Romania that would come only 3 months in the UK, not 6, that's the entire duration. There are significant differences because they are working side by side, often in the same field, and they have very different entitlements as workers. They have similar pay, the same pay, but very different rights. So, for example, on the Tier 5 and the seasonal worker visa, they don't have access to health care, even though they pay national insurance. They're on national minimum wage in the worst of situations. And they cannot bring families. The visa is only for 6 months or shorter and cannot be extended in any circumstances. And there are important concerns. We also found a high range of abuse and name calling that workers reported, misbehavior, for example, shouting or similar small things like this, but that really made a difference for workers. It's important to acknowledge that first and foremost, farms and rural spaces are now increasingly diverse, and the services, the support is not there. And the farmers need to come to terms with this diversity. And we often speak of dependency, but also we should also refer to contributions that the worker make. Within the space of a farm. There is that acknowledgement, but not necessarily within the local village or a small rural place. There are also significant concerns regarding the transition from pre-settled to settled status. 2/3 of our participants only had pre-settled. There's increased difficulty for returnees, and this is a major concern because every farmer we spoke to said they place tremendous value and they trust in those returnees who are more experienced, who they had a good relationship with. And they tend to be also family units. So they tend to be, we often come across the wife, the husband, the cousin, and the brother-in-law. And this would be a group that would travel annually. But similarly, those under the visa system and the Tier 5 also had similar networks or friendship groups that they didn't want to come alone. And under the new visa regime, you can only make an individual application, and there is no exception or light route for returnees if they are to come next year. You just start from zero, you would have any chance as anyone else applying. So that's another major concern. We also found that from those with pre-settled status, because this is agriculture and people with digital illiteracy, that many were very concerned that they couldn't access their digital status. Even when they arrive in the country, sometimes they tend to go to other areas after an initial period of unemployment in farming and go to another country. And then we have to also consider that these are migrants. This is also an aging population, and there is always a percentage that returns to the country of origin.
So, thank you, Roxana, for the presentation on migration and agriculture coming from your research with seasonal workers during this period of post-Brexit and during the pandemic. Morris, can I just check that you've got Roxana on? She's here. Yeah, maybe just put us, side by side as speakers. We're going to have a couple of minutes here because I know Roxana is in the middle of another conference, so has escaped and come to this one. So welcome to Belfast is first, Roxana. This is a strange way to welcome you to Belfast on this hybrid function. And welcome to Queen's University and the ESRC Festival. Right, great to see you, Roxana. And as I said, you're now zoomed into Belfast here with me. Thank you for your presentation. Are there any questions coming in? Not as yet. So I'm going to fire away. From your presentation, I find it really interesting, the areas around pre-settled and settled. I think that there are huge difficulties. I think we need to think, it was talked about before by Darren Ferguson of the Filipino community, that the land is so important to people. So the land in UK obviously is important and we need our food production. But the pre-settled and settled, could you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so thank you for that. I think it's really important because with this project, what I wanted to uncover is as well the presence of migrant and even short-term temporary migrants within other settings than the big cities. So you would often find them in villages and on land that is far away from city centers, high streets, and even entertainment, transport links. And they are present there for quite long periods of time, even they are temporary. For example, seasonal workers are there for 6 months. We're now looking at the new visa, a short-term visa for poultry workers or around Christmas time. Also further away from big city centers, they are mostly towards the outskirts of smaller cities, and particularly in Northern Ireland, there are quite a few. So I wanted to uncover and bring that presence through, and hence the collaboration with the illustrator. In terms of settled and pre-settled, this is the new scheme post Brexit offered to EU citizens. And what I found, as many of those working in these areas are Central and Eastern European who joined the EU later, hence had full rights relatively recent, they only have pre-settled status, which means that they will need to maintain, administer, and then accrue evidence to become eligible for settled status, which will allow them to essentially access indefinite leave to remain in the UK and become full citizens, still without voting rights, but full residents with permanent, with the right to stay in the UK indefinitely.
Yeah. You definitely raised the awareness, about how difficult it is for our food production and our farming. If we also have those issues around settlement as well, and since the post-Brexit times, and with our EU citizens, the impact, what impact will that make, coming into the next couple of months? We've already seen difficulties with lorry drivers, our supply of foods, but what impact do you think will happen, Roxana, now?
In terms of impact, it depends on where we look. In terms of, will we have food shortages or anything like this in the next couple of months, particularly around Christmas? I think that the policy interventions that have been introduced was particular to prevent that from happening, and that all indications are that that will be the case. The question is, moving forward, even 6 months down the line, or 5 years down the line, when this pre-settled will wear itself out and expires, so then what will happen with these communities? We know that, for example, there was support during this application period for USS, and this has disappeared in that form. Organizations cannot no longer access that kind of support, and if you have over 2 million people that are on that status, many of whom are very vulnerable, new communities, and if you also think that communities working in these areas in particular, and they are changing, right? So for those with USS European communities, they tend to come from certain countries. The largest countries would be Romania, Poland. But now if those from visa workers, they tend to come from Ukraine. So you change the country of origin, you need support in the community and civil society for those different languages, different community, different knowledge, to be able to engage with the new arrivals. And that is, if that is set to further change, for example, to Philippines, as it was discussed, this is also one growing tendency in the visas that I've seen, or Thai communities, then do we have that support? Are we ready to embrace that? Because what we see it's happening, most countries do have rely on migration, in particular these communities. But for example, in the US, they bring seasonal workers from Mexico. Mexico being also the largest community in the US, you have so many resources, communities, channels of communication and engagement. If you keep changing these communities and they are still on very precarious status while they are in the UK, then that is certainly an exposure for this community. So this is another thing that we have to think about, how to organize and how to manage the support, in particular how we can move forward and move resources from just the big cities and the largest urban areas further into the rural communities as well, and then not so big cities.
And I think there's a lot of lessons that we need to learn for Northern Ireland as well, to bring those points into action for the support. I think that the other two areas that I find quite interesting is we don't give enough credence or credit, as I suppose, to the skills in agriculture. And also you said diversity, they must have, people have diverse skills, they've got them from, their homelands, what they can actually bring to here, as well as the diversity of foods. So could you talk about, I saw that in your slide about diversity, and it just really hit home to me, we don't appreciate it enough. What are your views on that, Roxana?
Yes, certainly. There are many angles and many interesting points that could be made here. So certainly there is a really interesting accommodation of culture through food in the UK, and there's a long history of that. There's a long scholarship of that, and it's a very visible element as well in our building environment when we move, be it even in rural communities. Every pub has a very diverse menu if you want, incorporating different things, but I think we have to think that food is something that with which we engage on every day, multiple times a day, and we often don't think who does it, who contributed, and especially for fresh fruit and vegetables, or as well with meat and butchers, for example. This is handcraft. It is skilled, it's handcrafted. All the employers, the farmers that we've been speaking to in the project keep telling us that it's really hard to find and to train skilled work pickers that will do it within the time that they need to and with the skill level. So that it's really important for other fights as well to reduce food waste, because if they are damaged and they don't keep the aesthetic requirements by the supermarket, then you have to throw it away. So it's really important to have someone who is really good at it, has the experience, and can do it very fast, so that you get more produce out of the crops. And there is that perhaps this past crisis, if we can call it, within the food systems and farming, can make us think more about what is the value and what skills is involved around our everyday food items. It's also interesting for me, and something that I didn't expect with this project, human touch and how precious it is, and how much our food depends on being hand-picked and then treated with care. We have this conversation, for example, with social care about the emotional side, but there is also about human touch and how irreplaceable it is, because we may look at solutions of automations. They may get better. They are still not as good as human hands at this point in time.
So thank you. And on that, thank you so much, Roxana, for joining us. I know you have a really busy day, and there's so much care and human touch. I'm just going to pass you on to next. We have Drew Michael, who's going to be talking about, Dr. Drew Michael, to talk about welcoming communities, which just leads us nicely into that. How do we welcome our communities, give that support and human touch to everything? Thank you. You've certainly been an eye-opener for that last session. Thank you, Roxana.
Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. Thank you for the invitation to talk, and particularly to speak to some of the key issues that have already been brought up. I have a confession to begin with. I haven't been very good in my scholarly work or my practical work of marrying the idea of climate justice and trying to avert the oncoming climate catastrophe and the idea of forced migration and displaced migration, or forced displacement. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of my mistakes and some pathways that I have seen out through my years of working in 3 different continents with mostly forced and displaced peoples. And Timothy will take on and hopefully put some, in the second half of the presentation, some useful meat on the bones that I hopefully construct for you. I'm a little bit passionate about this, so there may be some Northern Irish speaking fast, but I will try to reduce my tempo to an eligible pace. When considering most of my work has been mirroring some of the hostile environments, particularly hostile environments that are intra-hostile. I've looked at the particularities of those who are displaced in areas and spaces that are already experiencing conflict amongst the quote-unquote included citizenry. And from this perspective, I've managed to understand that my lack of integrative thinking on these issues is actually problematic. What's important about displaced persons and those who have suffered from displaced persons is that there are very rarely one singular cause that has contributed to that displacement. Often, and we've seen in the language around migrants, refugees, asylum seekers, this monolithic thinking that is very low common denominators. We've seen our darling Home Secretary, in the light of the recent tragedy, try to reorientate populist nativist language. And really, of course, I think that this bordering language is something that you often come up against whenever we're talking about asylum seekers, refugees, and displaced persons more generally. Migrants are often seen as competition, resource competition in particular. This is often how it's framed. However, whenever we look at the narratives, and particularly with the groups that I've worked with, the narrative is often reshaped and seen by those who are subject to this discourse as not a competition, but a mode of equality and resource sharing, which doesn't particularly marry with the nativist discourses that we see emanating from the political class. And I have to stress that this isn't just a global economic north problem. This is what I've seen across different spaces, different continents, different ethnicities, and different socioeconomic backgrounds. But what's important about displaced people is that they tackle an intersection of thinking, particularly post-colonial thinking, tackling the idea of what it means to be excluded, and what I find, my word of the day, integrated. In the common parlance, whenever we talk about integration of those who are new to a space, it's shorthand for economic or labor integration. And it's framed automatically as a concept of competition over a dwindling resource space. And that creates further division. So whenever we talk about hostile spaces, and using my research as an example, as a base to launch this, hostile spaces that are often consumed with their own agenda, their own issue, in the government, in civil society, in public society, in civil service, we see, and our groups are experiencing a lack of oxygen in which they can discuss the issues that impact them, which also impact all of us. But whenever we frame economic integration or integration more generally, we understand that it's important that those groups new to a space have to be able to live, to be able to survive. But this language is also bordering us into narrower thinking. It takes away the human element, the human understanding of what it means to leave a home and to come to an environment that is new, a language that might be new, a context that might be new. We frame integration so narrowly that it loses, or it becomes easily co-opted into different language and more harmful language by policymakers above us. And more often than not, it falls into the idea of a good immigrant, a producer, someone who is contributing to the society around, rather than actually understanding, as we've seen before, a true cosmopolitanism, an idea that production and contribution is more than just your economic need, an economic need that is eating away at our physical environment around us, because it is constantly calling for the production and the consumption of our physical environment. And in many of these spaces, in many of these places, that consumption, as we've seen in the global economic south, that consumption is what contributes to forced displacement. So before I finish, I'll just set up my colleague Timothy to take over. We have to think about, and what we have seen amongst our groups that we are working with, is a concept of sustainability, a concept of Sustainability not only within economic terms, not only within integration terms, but also across the board. Social sustainability, an ability to be able to truly be heard and be heard beyond the paradigms of the politics that surround the current hostile environment, which is hostile, intra-hostile, and or internally hostile and externally hostile. Newcomers can help bridge those gaps with new understandings, new social spaces, and some Eileen has just mentioned, creating new avenues to understanding others, new understanding to understanding, or new ways of understanding ourselves. It's a process of debordering, physically debordering, and linguistically debordering. And hopefully that this process can be created in an environment that is already hostile, as I said, internally. If it can be done here, it is more likely to be able to be replicated elsewhere. So I will leave that kernel of sustainability on to Timothy.
Thank you, Drew. I'm happy to join virtually, and thank you everyone for organizing the event and contributing. It's also been great to see the comments coming in through the chat. In one sense or the other, I think we are in the right space here, Drew and myself, although we have, as Drew has outlined, have done little work that specifically touches on environment in the natural sense of the word. Much of what we have heard so far has been dealing with perception of people about what is sustainable in societal environments that they live currently, as well as in societal environments that they have left behind. The 2 points that Drew has raised has been critical throughout our work, both before the project Welcoming Communities and also on it. And these are really about reframing the perception of what it is that we're dealing with when any discussions involve people not from the place where they were born. We refer to these communities as newcomer communities. They are not migrants because very often that term is used to stigmatize individuals, as we have seen in chat. Nina M has expanded extensively, but also it is very often easy to include people's representatives based on their assumed identity with the group from which they hail from country or culture that they're coming from. And Kathy has commented equally that unfortunately we don't have enough visual representatives of visual representation of diversity in the province, in provincial decision making and institutions. But that on itself is a problem only on the surface. And the issue that we have run against across our work over the past years has been much more about the lack of understanding of overlapping impacts that lack of visibility or malappropriation of terms or malapplication of terms can lead to when thinking about the opportunities that individuals, rather than categories of analysis, migrants or refugees or asylum seekers or any of those, bring to our understanding of contribution to the societal environment that we all are a part of. So we encourage everyone in the forum, which would probably sound like a preaching to a choir, but also wider audiences, to consider the reference, as we have heard throughout the past 2.5 hours, to environment as a social environment that embraces both the natural, cultural, but also, but specifically a socially constructed view of what is our environment that we share across the board. That would make it easier for us to understand that everyone, whether a newcomer or local communities who have been there all along, do have similar perspectives and views on what their contributions as individuals and as members of variously positioned groups might be to both cultural exchange, political process, but principally to socioeconomic activities that underpin everything that we have been hearing here about, and specifically looking at reframing of discussion away from the focus on the natural environment only. In our work, specifically in Welcoming Communities project, what we hear very often that individuals who arrive in Northern Ireland, whether they have arrived as EU citizens or they have been labour migrants or are migrants, refugees or asylum seekers, they are very often running against the wall of being perceived as having arrived with a purpose that is not genuinely the one with which why they find themselves in Northern Ireland. Rather, many of them arrive there because they feel that they can contribute to the well-being of their community, maybe their community that hails from their home country, or maybe community in the village or in an area where they settle in Northern Ireland, but they always see themselves as contributing to well-being of society, regardless how small or big they define that. And in that sense, very often we have heard that individuals of newcomer or any other background in Northern Ireland are intimating that they do not understand why they are being pigeonholed as competitors for the scarce labour market resources, accessing jobs, or contributing to or availing of the services of the state, because they do too contribute all across the board. And then we know that without contribution of many newcomer individuals, we would be living in a quite different place, whether it is in accessing the availability of services of the state. The NHS has been up in the news quite some time now, but also we in the academic environment very often do not consider that a large number of people across both Northern Ireland universities are not have not decided to come to Northern Ireland. They came to contribute to education and the research process, as we have heard from the opening lines from Dina's contribution. So thinking about all of these processes, I would like to conclude that specifically in our project, Welcoming Communities, we appreciate that there is a diversity of views of what contributions newcomers may make to society where they find themselves, but we should always remember, and as researchers and practitioners, that we all are in societal environment, and then all of us contribute in our small ways to a more sustainable social, cultural, and as well natural place where we live. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Timothy, Andrew, Drew, and on the research project, Welcoming Communities, it really fits in with all the other areas around hostile environment. So from going from hostile to welcoming and to look at it in a strategic view. There's only one question, and I'm not really going to totally answer you, so apologies, but I'm just going to say to Kathy Dunphy, I just want to say, what can we do collectively to demand and achieve fairness of polling decision-making positions in Northern Ireland? Do check our website, mmecouncil.org. There's a lot of papers and stuff we're doing on it. There is the racial equality panel that's just met with the Northern Ireland executive this week. There is work going on. Are we doing it strategically is the other thing that you've heard today. We've talked about the PESL, the political, environmental, societal, technological, legislation, and in education sectors. Is it strategic? Who knows? I think we need further research, and this is the whole point of this seminar. That yes, true. You said there are so many voices missing. This is why the seminar came about, because we didn't have the diverse voices that are coming through about environmental issues that are so much to minority ethnic communities. And thank you for the debate today. I've seen a lot of chat about migrants, That has been very important. I hope that has raised awareness of how important everybody has to play in nature. And I just have Dr. Maurice McCartney, my fellow colleague here at the think tank, who's going to give us our closing remarks. So thank you, everybody, for your patience. And here we are.
Just very quickly before I make my concluding remarks, I think Timothy Garance and Drew Mikhail are probably well placed to answer that last question. So we'll, as with everything else that we're doing, we will post links on the website. We'll be tweeting about this. So follow us on at MME Council on social media, and as Eileen said, mmecouncil.org. And I think we'll just keep this very, very brief, because we are amazingly, this is unique in my experience, we have gone through this entire complex process and we've come in on time. Unbelievable. So I just want to thank everyone, thank Eileen and Dina and Darren for organizing the thing, to thank the ESRC Festival of Social Sciences for allowing us to put it on, to thank everyone who watched us online, and as I say, keep in touch. The conversation will probably continue here in the room, but you can keep in touch with us through those websites that I've just mentioned. And finally, to thank all of our speakers for this, for a great, remarkable and a complex, at times moving event today. I suppose if I just would reflect on one final thing, it seems to me the overall message from today's discussions is that someone mentioned the human touch. I think we can get very alienated from each other and think of these things as in the phrase of from the Harry Lime film, the Third Man film, you know, it's just one of those dots. If one of those dots stopped moving somewhere over on the other side of the world, would it mean anything to us? Well, they're not just one of those dots. They're our neighbors. And in the end, we have to emphasize the equality just as much as the sustainability and the environment issue, because in the end, we're all commoners on the one common. So thank you very much for your participation. Thank you very much for all your contributions and for listening. So thank you. Good afternoon.